Okay, this is Colleen Mount, and I did my energy and science research on the effects of mountaintop removal for mining coal. The research article I used was an examination of the effects of mountaintop removal, coal mining, on respiratory symptoms and COPD using propensity scores. It's by Michael Hendricks and Jahua Liu, and it was published in 2015 in the International Journal of Environmental Health Research. So just to give you guys a background, mountaintop removal is done in central Appalachia in the states of Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia, with a total of 12 million acres being mined. The practice involves clear-cutting forests and using explosives and heavy machinery to remove hundreds of feet of rock and soil to reach the coal underneath. The resulting material is then dumped into valleys, permanently burying headwater streams. As you can see, these beautiful forests and Appalachian mountains are just being leveled as much as 800 feet per blast. Environmental studies indicate that mountaintop removal creates local air and water pollution. This study was done in 2 rural areas in Virginia. So they took this town that was within 3 miles of a mountaintop mining area, and they took a town that was more than 20 miles away from a mountaintop mining area. And this study is the first study that was done using propensity scores. And what does that mean? Propensity scoring is a research tool to get to equal grouping where you're comparing non-equal groups. So the researchers identified 12 confounds, which is alternative explanations, and used the propensity scoring tool to rule out these confounds so that the research question was isolated. So things like, is the participant a smoker, or is the participant obese or a female or have heart disease, okay? And so they were able to identify those 12 factors that we'll talk about in a little bit and focus on this research question. What is the effect of living in a mountaintop removal environment versus a non-mining environment on the occurrence of respiratory symptoms and risk of COPD? Other details of the study include the data came from 682 total adults, some living in 3 miles of the MTR mine, and others living 20 or more miles away from the MTR mine. Volunteers went door to door asking participants survey questions that lasted for about 20 minutes. And the survey questions included health and disease questions, which was the focus of the study, and then demographic and lifestyle questions, which were part of the covariates. So this is a table found in the study that is before propensity scoring, and some of the confounds they use was college education, if they're married, overweight, obese, do they smoke, do they use coal in the home for heating. And as you can see, before the propensity scoring, these groups look very different. These numbers, the standard deviation difference is pretty big between these 2 groups of mountaintop removal and non-mining. But we'll be able to look at, in the next slide, after the propensity scoring, the standardized mean difference was very, very little. So they were able to isolate the research question, which was, does living near a mountaintop removal site increase the occurrence of respiratory symptoms and COPD? This graph shows that given the results of the propensity scores, researchers believe with a 95% confidence interval that the prevalence ratio of having a respiratory symptom when they live near or next to a mountaintop removal site is 1.44. And just to explain what this means, if the ratio was 1, which is represented by this blue line, then both communities, the non-mining and the mining community, would have equal chances of having respiratory issues. So they were able to prove, using the propensity scores, that you're much more likely to have a respiratory symptom if you live closer to a mine. And it's even higher for the COPD. Okay, the prevalence ratio is even higher. The limitations of this study is that it shows just one moment in time. Further study is needed to look at the relationship between exposure and development of the disease. Although, even though it's one moment in time, the communities are very stable, and they have an average of living in that community for 38 years. So they have been exposed to it for a very long time. Another limitation is there needs to be further studies with details of what is exactly in the air pollutants and what pollutants are found in diseased lungs. So knowing exactly what goes into the mining pollutants and then finding out medically what's in the lungs of these participants, it needs to be further studied. Participants self-reported their health information, and so they were asked if they had COPD or other respiratory diseases. There were no measures to ensure that this was a doctor's diagnosis. So what are the conclusions of the study? The evidence clearly indicates that people living in areas where MTR is practiced experience health problems that cannot be explained by traditional risk factors such as age, smoking, obesity, occupational exposure, or socioeconomic status. Research shows that air and water quality in these areas is impaired by mining in ways consistent with observed health disparities. Based on the findings of this and other studies, it's recommended that MTR be discontinued and alternative energy sources be used. So, one might wonder, don't we need the coal from these mountaintop removal sites? But it's found that using the data from the Energy Information Agency, it's been determined that mountaintop removal provides only 3% of our nation's electricity, and that percentage has been dropping for years. If mountaintop removal were ended tomorrow, not a single American would lose power. Coal-mined underground would be most readily available alternative for utilities in the short term, but in the long term, it is suggested to look to other forms of energy sources, such as wind and solar. So, applications to my classroom. What I would like to do is just show my students a summary of the study and show them what is being done to get this coal out of the ground, and show them this, final quote from Mr. Hendricks, Dr. Hendricks. We've seen that the people who live in these areas where mountaintop removal takes place have significantly higher rates of cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, chronic lung disease like COPD. And so what would we do? I would have them find out and research alternate energy sources. I'd have them get in small groups, and they would look at wind and hydropower, solar, geothermal, biofuel, and hydrogen. And I'd give them sources so that they could do some research in each of these 6 areas. And then they would have to make a decision with their group. Which option seems to be the most viable and why? And then why maybe is it so difficult to make that decision? So they could give reasons why it was difficult to make that decision. Finally, I'd want to inspire them to be the solution, and I'd give them and go through some resources with them for shrinking their carbon footprint and ways to save energy, and just encourage them to be the change in their families or extended families, communities, so that we can get off this dependence of mining. So, thank you.